Hi everyone, so I wanted to show you how I'd go about building a simple task management app using React and React hooks. I think this is a great little application to start if you're starting to learn React, or if you're used to building React components with class-based components. And moving over to functional components and using hooks to manage things like state. So here's the app. It's a very simple app. There's just an input here to which you can enter your task, hit enter, and it adds your tasks. So rather than using a database, we'll be using local storage, so that's persisting each task in the browser. So on refresh, they're still persisted, but there's no database connected. So I think this is a really nice way if you're just trying to get used to the React framework and don't want to get into using databases and things like that. This is just a really easy way to persist your tasks. So you can see if you inspect the application, go over to the application tab and then into local storage, you'll see that we have 2 tasks persisted, and each of them has a task ID and a task body. So that's the app, super simple. You can also remove a task just by clicking it. If you get stuck, I'll leave a link to the GitHub repo in the description below so you can use as a reference as you're going through the tutorial. So first we'll need to set up our project, and for small projects like this I really like to use Create React App, which is kind of a helper project that the Facebook team behind React set up so that we can quickly scaffold apps and start writing in React. So if you don't have that installed on your machine, you can use npm to install that globally. So in your terminal, you can just type npm I, which is short for npm install, -g, which means you want to install this globally, so you can access it anywhere on your machine. And then it's just the create React app package. And what that will do is that will get that installed for you, and you can, as I say, use that anywhere on your machine that you like. So once you've done that, navigate in terminal to where you'd like to build your project. So I'm in the directory that I'd like to start in, and what I'll do is I'll write create React app, and then the second parameter is the first parameter is just the name of the project. So I'm just going to call it local storage task manager. If you hit enter, that will start creating the app from the boilerplate that the React team built. So once that's finished scaffolding the app, we're ready to open it in our code editor and start building. So my code editor of choice is VS Code. So from the terminal I can type code and then the folder that I want to open up. So if I hit enter, that will open that for me, and I'm done with terminal now, so I can just close that. So as you can see, what Create React App does is it gives you a rough boilerplate to start building an app really quickly, so you don't have to set up any servers or anything like that, or Babel to compile your code. So you can see that there's a source folder, a public folder, and then your node modules. You'll mainly be working out of the source folder. Public is just the static files like the index.html, which all of your requests will go to with a React single page app, and things like the manifest and your favicon and things like that. So you don't really need to worry about the public folder, other than if you want to change the title of your app, which we'll do shortly, and then maybe update your favicon as well. But as I say, most of your work will be done in the source folder. We'll be deleting everything in here, but if you did want to see what these files do, you can open up your terminal. I use the built-in VS Code terminal. So if you go to the root of your project, you can type npm start, which is a command you'll do when building all of your apps using Create React App does. And what that does is it spins up a server, as you can see there, starting development server. And what that will do is it will point at your index.html file and compile just this basic app, really. And that's the default app that you'll see on any Create React App project. But as I say, I tend to clean this folder out and then start from scratch, so we'll do that now. The quickest and easiest way to start from scratch is if we stop our development server. We can then type rm-rf, which basically force deletes any path that you give it, and I'll just do the source folder, and you should see up here that it deletes that there. So we're done with that for now. So what we can do is we can then just recreate that source folder, and then what we'll do is we'll create an index.js file. So for most, if not all of the React apps that you'll build, this index.js file tends to have a similar structure. So what we first need to do is import React, and that is just from the React package. And what Create React App does is it installs, using this React scripts package, it installs all the dependencies for a React app that you'll need. That's things like the React core files. You'll see that it installs the React DOM package, and then it will also install build files like Babel, so that you can transpile your ES6 code into a format that the browser will understand, essentially. So so we first need to import React from React. We also then need React DOM from React DOM, and essentially we use React DOM to mount our app onto the DOM, essentially. So they're the two imports that we need to create a basic React app. We'll then need some form of component to mount. So I'll just write a simple app component. So we'll use an arrow function here, and then we'll directly return just h1 tag with app. And then all we want to do is we want to use React DOM, and we're going to use the render method, and we want to render our app component, and where we want to render that is to document.query selector, and then the selector that we want to use in the index.html is just this root component, so it's just an ID, a div with an ID of root. So then we'll just do root. And then if we save that, that is a super simple app that we've made. So what we can do is go back to our terminal, and we can run npm start again. And what you should see is literally just app printed out in h1 tags on the page. And there you go. So that is a very basic React app. So the next step from here is we'll render out a really simple list with some fake tasks, just so we can visualize how our to-do list is going to look. So what I'll do is above here, I'll build the first few components just in this index.js file, and then we'll get a bit of structure together for our application, and we'll split out each component into its own file. So what I'll do is I'll create a new component, and we'll call that task list, and that is going to be an array function. So that's now created a functional component. So what we can do from there is we just want to return our basic markup, which is going to be a list which inside has our tasks basically. So if we just render out a few tasks, that is roughly how our task list will look markup wise. So then what we can do after that is from our app component, which is essentially our root component, we can then just return that task list. So when we click save, we should see there that we've got our 3 tasks. So we're going to completely change the look of that using styled components, which is CSS and JS. But for now, that's at least got a structure together for how we want our markup to look. So rather than hard coding these tasks as list items, it would be better if we could dynamically generate these from a data source of some sort. So in the long run, and later on in this project, we'll be grabbing our task items from local storage. But for now, it will be good to get just a temporary data set that we can loop through in our task list, so that we're not relying on hard-coded items. So what we can do is we can just create a data set using a hard-coded array. And what this array is going to have is each task will be an object within this array, and each task will have an ID. So that'll be a unique ID. We can just do a number for now, but we'll generate a unique ID later on. And then it also wants to have a task body, which is just going to be a string for whatever that task body is. So task 1, task 2, etc. So we could create a few of these. So 3 is enough for now, just enough for us to loop through. So when we do get our tasks from local storage, we'll be passing them to our task list as props from our app component. But for now, we can just map through this data variable. So how we do that is data.map. So that's just an array method. And then what map takes is, so it maps through, so it loops through each of the objects within our array. And then we'll reference each object as just task. And then using an arrow function, we can pull out from that current object iteration what we want. So we just want the task body. And then we also want to wrap this in a list item. And then seeing as that is technically JSX, we then want to escape that to pull our body value off of our task from the object. So if we save that over here, you probably won't see any difference because we're using the same values, but we can go then, we'll go and add another task here, and you'll see that that should update. So that means we're correctly looping through our data array. So our next step would probably be to create a new component, which would be the task itself. So we could just leave this as just the list item, but if we put that into its own component, we could then have its own styles and things like that. So before we create that component, I think it's a good chance to organize our files a little bit better. So what I'll tend to do is I'll first split app off into its own component, and I'll do that at the base of the source folder. So if we create a new file called app.js, and this is essentially going to be its own functional component. So as with any other React component, we'll import React. We'll then want to pull out this app component, and then we'll want to export that as default. So I've seen some people like to export app inline, so just exporting the arrow function like this, but I don't tend to like doing that, because if you get a component which is a lot longer than this file, so it's 100, maybe 200 lines long, if you have a lot of methods and things like that, I tend to like being able to just scroll to the bottom and seeing what the default export is, just in case you have a few other smaller components within that file. It's nice to know which component is the default, so I like to keep it at the bottom of the file there. So you see that task list is needed to be its own file. So rather than pulling task list into the app component, we'll make it its own component. So inside of the source folder, I like to create a components folder, and then in there, depending on how you like to structure your components, some people like to have each of their components inside a folder, and then inside of that folder it has the component JS file, and then it might have its test file, and then it might have its styles JS file, and that just keeps each component very confined, so it can be moved about between projects, and it doesn't depend too much on any other part of the application. So that's what I'll do. Some people just dump the component JavaScript file directly within components, and then have their styles within the file itself. This will make more sense as we go on, but I'll make a folder for each component. So this is going to be the task list component, so we'll make a task list folder, and then within there we'll do the task list component file. So like we did with the app component, we'll import React from the React, and then paste our component in, and then we're going to export that as a default too. So again, this is relying on the data array. So what we could do is we could either pull it in and paste it here, or seeing as in the long run I know that I want to pass the task list in as props, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that off of the props, so you'll see that that's then resolved that dependency, and then I'm going to place this within our app file. And as you can see here, we still need to pull in the task list component, so import task list from components, task list. And then rather than calling this data, we know that it's tasks, so we'll rename that, call this tasks, and then we want to give the prop of tasks to our task list, and that is just going to be this tasks array. So all we need to do now is, as you can see here, import our app component in to our index.js file, and hopefully we're now back at the Where we were before, everything's rendering properly, but our project is a little better organized. So what I'd like to do next is to add a bit of styling to our application. So there's a number of ways that you can add CSS to a React or a JavaScript project. One of them is just to create a CSS file and then include that in your index file. You can use Sass, so each component could have its own styles.scss file, and then you just import that. How I like to do it is to use a library called styled components, and what that allows you to do is to write CSS and Sass inline in your components, and that's essentially called CSS in JS. So what we'll do is we'll install that. So just in your terminal, in the root of your project, npm I, which is npm install, and that will, as default, save that as a dependency in your package JSON file, and the package is called styled components. So I won't go too much into how styled components work, but you can head over to the following website to look more into their documentation. But essentially how it works is you essentially render a new component, and the syntax is a little bit different to something you may have used before, but it essentially uses template literals, and you can write your CSS or Sass really as you normally would in a CSS file. So we'll be using that a little bit, and we'll be using a couple of functions from the style components library to create quite a basic style in our application. But I just think it's a really nice way of styling each of your components. So really the main benefit of using a CSS in JS library such as style components is it restricts the styles throughout your app to a component level, so none of your CSS will leak into other components, and they'll be confined to just the component that you initialize them in. You can create global styles, so you might want to add styles to the body or the HTML, and we will do that in this app a little bit later, but the main idea is so that you can keep your styles confined to each component. So it's really simple. And now that we've installed the package, we want to import styled, which is the default export from the package, and the package is styled components. And then what we essentially do is we create a new constant, and we'll call this styled task list, and that is going to be equal to styled, and then essentially what styled gives you is the majority of the HTML elements that you might want to style. So that could be a UL, it could be an LI, it could be a div or a paragraph tag. So what we want is a UL. So that's the component type or the element that we want to style. And then within template literal tags, we can then just write normal CSS really. So you can do background color, and we can just set that to red, and nothing will change on your app until you actually use this like a component. So just like any other component, we can change our UL tags because we've said that we want to use the styled UL element. This will you'll be able to replace an unordered list element in your app. So we can just replace that, and once we click save, you'll see that it's added the red background just from writing normal CSS. And the nice thing about this is that you don't, from styled components, other libraries libraries that I've used which give you CSS in JS is you might write your CSS slightly different, so you might need to write in camel case rather than hyphenated exactly as you would in CSS, and this is one of the best libraries for writing CSS in JS that I've found, and it tends to be my go-to whenever writing CSS in JS for my components.